Hey Ryan, hey Yago. Okay, we're all on stage. So welcome everybody. Um, I haven't hosted a Twitter. Well, in fact, the last time I hosted a Twitter space, it was called Twitter. I haven't hosted an X space for quite some time. I've been joining lots of other people's spaces, but I really wanted to do this one because if you haven't met Yago, Yago can do a bit of an introduction to himself as well. But he's somebody I really respect in the Bitcoin community. He's doing some amazing work, building, improving Bitcoin and building innovation on top of Bitcoin and different chains and various other stuff. Um, but I often thought that as Bitcoiners, we'd have a lot more people that would have opinions about the geopolitical and war side, because I've always thought of Bitcoin as an exit from the oppression of what I call proof of weapons network fiat currencies. And it was quite surprising to me to not see more people actively engaging in this. And I put it down to a couple of reasons. Maybe they've exited the system and they don't care about the system, and they think they're okay. Um, or, they're just simply not engaged in the topic and don't think it affects them. And I personally believe this is going to affect us all if we don't understand what's happening. And so I've given a lot of my opinions. I just come off my live stream on YouTube where I give updates on everything that happened in Bitcoin this week, and then the second part is a bit of educational content around the geopolitical side and how I see the world. And I see the world very differently to Yago, but we agree on the same outcome. And so we've been engaged in what became a few heated debates because we're so opposed on our views. And Yago said, "Look, let's just debate this. It's not the type of thing that you can do well on Twitter, because you say something in a short number of characters and it doesn't come across in the right way, and it may come across as very, very different." So I wanted to bring up and just experiment with this new format. And so if anyone likes this idea, do me a favor. Can you share this space right now? And let us know if you enjoy this type of thing, because I do believe that Bitcoin is geopolitics, and I believe that Bitcoin has a huge part of going to play a huge role in whatever happens next, however far this escalates. And I think everyone should be up to date with those things. So that's the background on why we're doing it, and it's an experiment. I also brought Ryan up to co-host. He often co-hosts on many of the largest spaces out there, like Mario Space, who I regularly speak on the finance side, and many other things. So I thought that in case I don't even know, Ryan. We're very grateful to have you here. I'm not sure if we're going to get heated or whether moderation is going to prove things, because we end up. I think this is going to be pretty respectful, and I think we see a line in things, and we have a very different view. And so I think it's just going to be interesting and educational for everybody. And I hope it's going to go that way. But just in case the conversation can get a bit unbearable, and then sometimes it's much better to have a moderator and a co-host to make sure we're not going off track and can keep it on track. So, Ryan, I really appreciate you giving us a bit of
My
time to do
pleasure.
that.
I'll play like a referee. I'll let you guys go at it until it gets a little too crazy. Then I'll stop the fight and reset the room, and we'll keep going. But I'm looking forward to this, guys.
Awesome. Okay. Um, so I tell you what, why don't we start with so I think all my audience know me, but just in case you don't, I wrote the first published book in the world to include Bitcoin. I used to work in investment banking. I left investment banking in 2006, just before the financial crisis, and I gave lectures around the world as part of a monetary reform community. When I tried to create a bank, a non-fractional reserve bank, I failed and found Bitcoin. And with my last bit of debt, I went and flew across to speak in Prague at the first Bitcoin conference. And I bought some Bitcoin at $3. And I've been involved in the community ever since. And as Bitcoin treated me so well, I ended up investing in lots of other companies, and I'm a shareholder in over 100 of the largest companies in the industry, and pivoted Bank to the Future from a bank to actually supporting entrepreneurs and investors that want to build and protect their wealth using Bitcoin. And we kind of went from this tiny niche product of 50 people that should never have succeeded, to the largest financial institutions in the world launching ETFs, and people like Yago who are trying to stretch the boundaries of what Bitcoin can do, because we're ideologically aligned in terms of Bitcoin. And so that's my background. But I take a very contrary a view that I think most people in the West find at times offensive, because I kind of see the world as the world, and there's lots of evils in the world, and I see governments as inflicting many evils. And I'll go a little bit, into. I'll tell you what. I'll do that little bit of an intro, and then Yago can go through his, and then we'll get into the debate. But I think when I see governments, I see different types of governments. I see governments that have an amazing system in their own country of free speech, but inflict massive evils in other areas of the world that doesn't affect their people, and then control the media and the narrative in their own country to make them think that they're the good people and everyone else is the bad people, when they're doing a lot of good in their own country, but they're doing really bad things in other countries. Then you've got governments that are just blatantly really horrible, oppressive regimes. But often it's as a result of some kind of oppression that a lot of the world doesn't understand, and they're framed in a way where they're just these crazy, evil regimes. And sometimes it requires a bit of nuance to understand these things. And I've always found myself to try and understand the nuance. And I've never been a patriot type of person. I was brought up by a Christian father, a Jewish mother, and a Muslim family. And I see beauty in all these faiths when practiced correctly. And I see extremism when these faiths are used in order to inflict some of the worst things that have nothing to do with the original scriptures in which govern these beautiful things and the relationship we have with God. And so from that, I try and always see things from different parts. And whenever a narrative is really obvious, and I think this is why I found Bitcoin and got into monetary reform. Whenever a narrative is really obvious, I really actively seek out, well, why do people do that? Do people really just, for the sake of it, like blow themselves up in order to think that they're fighting for a holy war? Or is there something more to it? And I've always sought out those answers, and that's what led me to finding Bitcoin when no one else could see it. Because I thought maybe there is a way of owning your own money, spending your own money, and having a money supply that's fixed. And it allowed me to ask those questions when no one else was willing to ask it, and more importantly, believe in it, at a time when no one else was willing to believe in it. And I think that thinking about it and reflecting upon it is kind of a core of who I am and what I believe in. Now, when I've shared several stages with Yago, and I think he's a real. I'd love to understand a bit more about your background in terms of like what drives you, your family background, things like that, in terms of your allegiances and what led you to Bitcoin and then led you to these things. Because I found you to be an incredible critical thinker, and somebody that thinks outside the box. So why don't you intro you and give a little bit of intro to the topic and how you feel, and then maybe that will lead to the next question and we can start debating.
Thanks very much, Simon. I wonder if you can make me co-host. That was a lovely introduction, um, and I'd like to be appear to you. Awesome, thank you. Um, yes, so thank you very much. So a little bit about my background. Um, so on one side of my family, most of my family were wiped out in the Holocaust. Of my father's seven siblings, only one other survived. And um, the way my family survived the Holocaust, and the reason a lot of people don't realize this, but for Polish Jews, the survival rate was less than 1%. It was it was almost complete annihilation. And so I'm, a statistical anomaly. I'm the result of that less than 1% that survived. And the way they survived was they were smart enough to, as the Nazis were invading Poland, take everything they owned and convert it into jewels so that it would be transportable. And in the end, they had to transport those jewels inside of themselves. And they ended up making their way through Nazi controlled Europe, living in, well, the longest place they survived was they managed to pay off a farmer to let the farmer live, let them live under um, the farmer's house in a sewage ditch. And so one side of my family sort of raised me on those stories and on the heroism that was involved in surviving as well. Um, my family were leaders in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. They were engaged in the topic that we'll be discussing now, violent resistance. Um, and other members of my family were involved in a breakout from Treblinka concentration camp, which is a fascinating story in and of itself. And my family are also the primary donors and founders of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. On the other side of my family, um, and where I grew up, was South Africa. My South African family also ended up in concentration camps, ironically, because they were German Jews. And so when Britain was at war with Germany, they were rounded up and placed in concentration camps. One of them died as a result of that. And then later, when South Africa became an independent and a country and introduced apartheid, my family became uh, activists against apartheid, eventually ended up joining the ANC. And part of my family were forced to flee in the middle of the night from South Africa because they had been designated as terrorists by the apartheid regime. And when I was a little boy, I um, was engaged in smuggling gold out of South Africa in order to get money to my family who were on the run. Um, I spent part of my life living in Israel. And in Israel, I was involved in both sides of the conflict. I was a soldier. I was also a conscientious objector. And as a conscientious objector, I went through significant personal, you know, I had to take on significant personal loss within the military, was demoted. I ended up with a dishonorable discharge. I had my driver's license taken from me. I was declared to be mentally unfit. Was denied the ability to take certain jobs. Um, but I've also been shot at um, and have had to return fire. I've also spent my life engaged in activism. Um, I've been politically active. I've taught and volunteered at Arab schools. And most of the time that I lived in Israel, I chose to live in Arab neighborhoods. Um, and it was this sort of background, an understanding of the need for financial sovereignty as the cornerstone of any other uh, form of liberty. Property rights are the single most important guarantor for both individuals and societies of extended human rights, um, as well as my interest. Later I became more interested in technology. My interest in technology, my interest in science, rationality, human progress, all of those things combined so that in 2000 and I think it was 2011, when I first heard about Bitcoin, for me, as opposed to I think a lot of people, when I read the white paper, it shocked me. And I realized that everything I'd been doing up until then was probably going to change, and I would probably spend the rest of my life trying to work on, improve, develop, and promote what I saw as a technology which could act as a borderless, um, universal guarantor of property rights and hence human rights across the world. And indeed, for the last 13 or 14 years, it's been my singular focus. So that's a little bit of me.
That's absolutely fascinating, Yago, and I'm really glad for you sharing those experience. So, should we start with when you see the types of things that I'm tweeting, and I think you want to push back pretty passionately. What is the way that you see the world from all your experience that differs from the way that I see the world from my experience?
Well,
What do you think that is?
I think before getting into differences, it's helpful to try and figure out where we have commonalities, and which assumptions we share. And a core assumption for me here that I've already mentioned is the importance of human liberty, individual liberty, and that these things rest on um, ultimately property rights and by extension other forms of rights. But I think it's also important how we arrived there. And so I'm going to make an argument now, and I'd like to know if you agree. So I would argue that we have a lot of cultures and we have a lot of societies um, right now in the world and historically. And people have lived in many, many different ways and have held all kinds of different cultural and moral assumptions. But it's become extremely unfashionable to say what I'm about to say, which is that I believe that we are part of a superior culture, of the best culture that has ever existed. And some people call it Western culture, some people call it weird culture for, Western industrial culture. Some people call it Judeo-Christian culture. I think all of those miss the mark. I would call it liberal culture. And the um, the things that make liberal culture different are reflected in the kinds of things that it did which are different. And the reason that I say that it is the superior culture, the culture that um, I think is the best, and that I think we have to realize is very weird, very unusual historically, precious, and fragile. The reason I say this is because this is the culture that ended slavery. It's the culture that liberated women. It's the culture that ended imperialism, that introduced the idea of rule of law, that introduced concepts like free speech, that invented industrialization and free market capitalism, that created the scientific method, and that is currently in the process of ending the Malthusian trap that humanity has been trapped in since the dawn of time, and effectively is the first culture to end in any significant way poverty. Now, those are basically all of the great ills that humanity has had to deal with. And this is, the last 200, 250 years where we've had liberal society are the only period in time where we've actually made significant, impactful, and lasting changes. And so if I were to judge societies, it would be on that basis. And on that basis, I think we've got something now extremely precious, special, and I think we shouldn't be ashamed to say superior. And I'd be interested to know if you agree with that.
Yeah, okay. That's a great starting point. So the way that I see that is a lot of what I value, um, and what makes me happy in life are all those qualities. The more free market I'm in, the more Austrian economics, the more hard money I'm able to engage with, the more freedom of speech you give me, the more technology that allows me to communicate with different cultures. And these are the things that are the fabric of life for me. But I also value other things. I value my relationship with God. I value my family values. I value things that sometimes get left behind in other cultures, and these are just individualized things that are just important to me. And as I get older, the things that I used to value change as well over time. And I thank God every day that I was lucky enough to be born on the right side of my government's actions. And I thank my God every day, but feel a lot of guilt towards those that were on the wrong side of my government's actions. And so I see it as I've got all these things that I value in life. And I know that there's people on the other side of the world that have got less of that because of actions that historically happened as a result of the very actions that gave me the freedom and all the things that I value in the first place. And so when I achieved a level of financial wealth where I thought I could make an impact in the world and do whatever I want, my immediate belief is, well, what does God say we're brought on this earth to do? Well, we're here to serve humanity, and we're here to fight oppression. And these are my religious beliefs of what we're meant to do. And so if God gives us a gift, and God gives, puts us in a certain situation, it's because God wants us to use that in order to use your privilege to fight the oppression. And the more and more I look at it, I find that the governments that have been able to give what we both consider a higher standard of living, which may not be measured with the same moral ground, but people value family, and it's led to divorce rates and all sorts of stuff that are kind of a side effect of certain cultures. Um, and so it depends what. But I do believe that the privileges that we have has come at somebody else's oppression. And I think superiority is a word that gets in the way of my core belief that I believe I was brought on this earth in order to serve humanity. And the luck of where I was born, and the luck of how I was, the privilege that are given to me, is not something that I kind of value in a patriotic way. I just see it for what it is. I got lucky, and somebody else got really unlucky. And I'd love for the world to experience what I experienced. But I don't think that one government inflicting their version of what they want for the world works. And so foreign policy and trying to get the world to experience democracy and the things that have worked in that culture has often led to worst results and worst outcomes, because I was brought up in school where, I went to a Judeo-Christian school, and I was brought up on one side of the family to believe that I'm the chosen one, and that I'm this superior religion. And another side of my family was brought telling me, hey, the Christians, we're the good people. We're the ones that that should be exporting our way. And when we went and invaded India, we're trying to bring an opportunity to India. India needs us, and if we can just give them our cultures and our ways, then they're going to be. I was brought up to justify, and like I'd imagine if I went to American school, which I didn't, and I'm not American. I imagine I was brought up to believe that the settler colonialism and massacring of the native Indians is probably deleted from history, and led to believe that our founding fathers and independence from Brits and stuff, that they needed. When you look at Hollywood, it paints these cowboys and Indians with the evil Indians, when actually the cowboys were the evil. And when American independence happened, you're celebrating American independence because the Brits and the Europeans were the evil, and you were fighting for freedom from that. And when America got, black rights, and there was evil massacres of people that were considered acts of terrorism that looked very much like October the 7th, that were forgiven by the black, that were inflicted by the black people onto the white people because of the oppression. And it was the only way that they could fight against that. And it was a resistance movement that was painted as terrorism because they had to fight against such oppression. And so that's how I see it. Everything that we have is at the expense of somebody else, and so I don't see it as supremacy. I see it as a zero sum game.
Thanks, Simon. I want to. So I think one challenge that I have with what you've responded is it's extremely broad, and I was trying to narrow us down to see if there are places that we agree. I think you seem to agree on the values that I mentioned, like the things like ending slavery, liberating women, ending imperialism, introducing the very idea of free speech or rule of law, inventing industrialization, ending the Malthusian trap of poverty. I think you see these, like I do, as huge leaps forward for all of mankind. Um, but you take issue, and I expected you to, with with the word superiority. Um, and so let me tackle this challenge that you have and respond to a few other things that you said, and I'll try and bring us closer to sort of narrowing the scope of conversation, because otherwise we're going to talk past each other. So you feel uncomfortable with the term superior, and I would argue that one cannot have a, a sense of values without having a sense of good and bad, good and better. The very idea of having a system of values, a system of morals, requires you to be able to be a discerning, discriminating individual. You need to discriminate between bad and good. And so the idea that we should be reticent to say, I believe this is superior, places us in a situation where we become value nihilists, we become moral nihilists um, by default. And so I think it's a very dangerous tendency that we have in our society now, that we shy away from standing and providing a full-throated defense of the very values and the value hierarchy that we have. So that would be point number one. Point number two, that you were arguing, I think, is that all of these things that I just described, right? The wealth of the West, but also the end of slavery, liberating women, introduction of rule of law, industrialization, science. These things were somehow stolen, that it was a zero-sum game, that it was Asia and Africa versus the West. The West went to India, went to Africa, and somehow extracted those things from those places. I would argue that this is entirely ahistorical and actually makes no sense, because those things didn't exist in those places. They were invented. They've never existed before 200 or 250 years ago. They are the result of a historical moment where somehow a culture, something clicked, ideas changed, and a new form of culture was created which could incubate and produce these ideas. Now, um, there's this idea that the um, the Europe or the West or whatever became rich by having colonies, and this is not true from an economic or mathematical perspective. At no point were the colonies a significant driver of the economy, for example, of Great Britain. The domestic economy was always 80% or more of the growth of the economy. In other words, industrialization happening in the UK is what drove the growth of the UK's economy. And it's also not true because ultimately managing these colonies proved to be very expensive. But putting those ideas aside, because those are people will argue those points. I think it's much easier to show that this is the case. There have and we can do it very simply. There have been throughout all of human recorded history empires. The Mayan Empire, the Incan Empire, the Chinese Empire, the multiple Chinese empires, the Mongol Empire, the Caliphates, the Russian Empire, the um, the Bantu Empire. None of them, despite conquering many peoples and many lands and having the ability to extract value, none of them produced liberation of women. None of them ended slavery. None of them created industrialization. And so clearly, it's not by having a colony or an empire. It's not by rape and pillage. It's not by any of those means that these things have been created. These things that we cherish have been created through a new idea, the idea of liberalism. And it is exactly that idea which I wish to defend. And it is exactly that idea which I believe is so fragile and so ahistoric, so unusual that it could prove to be in existence merely for the blink of an eye unless we defend it. Now, why do I raise all of these points? I raise these points because when one takes the two things that you said together, an embarrassment about saying that there is superiority and false belief that these things emerged because we stole them from somewhere, you end up with the guilt that is the central theme of Western um, academic, perhaps leftist thinking today, in which I think one can see that thread of guilt throughout what you tweet and through what's motivating you. And here I'll turn to one last thing that you said and use it as an example. You spoke about the settler colonialism of the United States with the cowboys and the Indians. And you said that the Indians were the good guys, the cowboys were the bad guys. And then the second point that you made about it was that in America today, they try to hide what they've done to the Indians. Now, I think both of those points are completely wrong. So I'll start with the idea that they are trying to hide. The very idea of settler colonialism emerged from Western thought. It emerged from a tradition of Christian universalism. It emerged from the universities of France and the East Coast of the United States in the 20th century. And those ideas were taught to people from across the world. They were taught to Western people, but they were also taught to the many people who came from across the world to study from Africa or Latin America or China in Western universities. And they've been exported. And we have, so this idea that we've been trying to hide those ideas is completely wrong. In fact, I would say that liberal society has done something that no other society has done before. It has exported as a almost on an industrial scale its criticism of itself to the world and has provided the language and the intellectual frameworks with which the rest of the world, as well as itself, criticize um, the liberal society. And it's tragic. It's tragic because the intellectuals who go to, if you're a Dominican or a Nigerian or a Cuban intellectual, and you've studied in a French or an English or an American university, and you take these ideas with you, you're taking back with you ideas that are going to be actively harmful to your society. You're taking back ideas that the world is zero sum, that ultimately what matters is this idea of oppression and victimhood, and that by decrying your victimhood, you can somehow move forward in the world, rather than taking those ideas, which are fundamental, which were the root of liberal society, and which allowed the self-criticism to to be created, um, which are ideas of property rights, ideas of equality, ideas of rule of law, and particularly, most importantly, ideas of market capitalism. And so, weirdly, the US has, and Western society in general, has exported luxury beliefs that it can afford of self criticism, and has unfortunately exported them to people who really what they need are are the more fundamental pieces which allowed the luxury to have that kind of criticism exist in the first place. And I think it stunted the growth of many countries. The second point was that you said, so just to make my point clear, this isn't being hidden by the West. It is a stream of consciousness which is native to and was born in the West. Um, Now, with regards to the idea that the cowboys were the bad guys and the Indians were the good guys, I think that is as ridiculous as saying that the cowboys were the good guys and the Indians were the bad guys. And I think if there's one thing that I've heard you say, is that having that kind of black and white thinking goes against everything, all of the nuance that you would like to introduce. They were both terrible by our standards. They were fighting over territory. They were killing each other. And in that respect, they were no different from any of the peoples who had existed before them. What is different is the guilt that we now have. And just to illustrate this difference, right, we see in liberal societies this kind of guilt um, in ways that we don't see them elsewhere. The Turks definitely have a calculated program of denying the Armenian genocide. The Germans make sure to teach their children about the horrors that they inflicted on the world, and particularly on Jews, from the moment they are born. The Chinese deny that they've ever engaged in any genocide, despite engaging over millennia and engaging now in multiple genocides. In America, they teach, you know, textbooks written by Howard Zinn, who invented ideas like settler colonialism and criticizes, and you know, the entire new wave, the wave of new historians is what is taught in high schools in the US. And so free speech and rational thinking have also introduced a self-criticism that is unique to liberal societies. And I'll finish on this. I think it's really important for this conversation that we decide whether or not we can agree that it isn't a zero-sum game, and indeed something new was created here, because otherwise, I think that we are coming to the world with two very different frames. The frame of zero-sum is, okay, you know, it's merely a power struggle, whereas the frame that I'm trying to present is that progress is possible.
Awesome. Okay. I think that really helps us kind of understand like the foundational ideologies that make up the way that we're communicating with each other and have been communicating with each other. So I think that was really useful. And so what I'd attempt to do is this is what we have to understand about ourselves as humans. We have something called a reticular activating system in our brain. And a reticular activating system is the part of our brain that stops us from going insane. And somebody that has gone insane, or what we would call insane, is because one of the conditions is that their reticular activating system has got so overstimulated that they can't delete information. And so, for one of my appreciations of how humans work is that there's a part of our brain that only sees the things that we want to see and deletes the things that we don't want to see. And so, both of us could be right, but our reticular activating system is focusing on the things that back up our map of what allows us to function and be productive. And so, an example, sorry for this tangent, but I think it's just useful. Um, when you buy a new car, you suddenly see that car everywhere. That car was there just as much before, but you weren't noticing it before because you didn't buy that car. And this is the whole function of how our brain works. And I've noticed this on Twitter Spaces. So everyone started with an opinion on October the 7th, and that opinion was based upon the values and the beliefs and the media and the environment in which you were born or live in, and the different places in which you, and that makes up this grand sum of you ignoring certain information and focusing on other information that makes you more productive because of the way our brains work. And so immediately when I saw October the 7th, I saw a breakout from an open air prison that led to atrocious acts as a result of decades and decades of oppression that led to no other income and a media that very deliberately, in a skilled way that I've never seen before, completely changed the narrative of how people should think about what just happened. And in fact, went as far as evil things like completely making up 40 beheaded babies that were designed intentionally to justify the genocide that was about to happen next because certain people live in an environment where they've been brought up to believe that they are the superiors, and the inferiors, these crazy terrorists that for no reason whatsoever want to kill the West because they believe that their religion is superior to the way that we live. And we've been brought up very deliberately to believe the things that we believe in. And part of the challenge and struggle in life for me, and I think for you, because you've had such a diverse background, which is why I so much appreciate the debating you and understanding how you think, um, is based upon exactly what was installed in us as children in school and media, and that carries on. And the beauty of today is that we get to break free about that. And what I do agree with you is there are certain cultures where the regime is so oppressed because they've chosen a different way, whether it's more communistic way of organizing a country versus a more capitalistic way of organizing a country, has led to the fact that we're able to experience and understand and communicate on a Twitter space with people all around the world. And that came from free markets, from a capitalist ideal, which I value so much. But when I look back in history, and then we'll get back to like where we are today, I think, I see capitalism was invented in the Dutch Empire, and it was the Dutch East India Company with the Dutch Central Bank, with the first public offering of shares in the Dutch East India Company, that invented the ship in order to expand territory and take goods. And they outsourced their labor to the British because the British were the cheap labor at the time. And the British then learned how to create naval ships, and the British East India Company, and how to build the central bank, and how to create stock markets where people could sell capital for their ideas. But the original businesses, the original IPOs, as it were, the original public offerings were built upon currency and what I consider to be acts that were extremely oppressive for others that did not know how to use these financial weapons of mass destruction because they didn't invent them. And so when I see Hong Kong, which I lived in for 5 years, I see, yes, a bunch of people that want to stand up for the fact that they live in British common law, and they like the level of freedom, they like the level of capitalism, and they don't like the fact that China has an agreement. But the history, I think this highlights it perfectly, what you're trying to say. The history is that in reality, we used the British East India Company in order to take opium from the Indians, in order to get as much of their gold as possible, in order to get the Chinese people addicted in an opium war. And we created a bank called HSBC, which led to the drug trafficking industry that led to getting a whole nation in China addicted to opium so that we could steal as much of their silver as possible. Um, and uh, and then when they gave us Hong Kong, we negotiated that they would give us a corner of their country, and then we used that for our own means in order to try and expand our ideas, despite the fact that that country didn't want those ideas in the first place. And I think a lot of those, and I could go into Ghana, where they had a currency that was working. They had agri-beads, and then us as European glass makers, we invented glass. And through that innovation, we decided to use it for oppressive means. And so we hyperinflated their currency by creating lots of fake beads that then destroyed their currency. And then we created a transatlantic trade where America and the UK essentially created the slavery industry in order to build our capitalist empires. And those history is all around us today. Now, I don't use that as guilt in I feel responsible for that. The I feel the guilt is an empowerment in order to take any privilege that I feel I was able to, because I found myself in a world where I was able to get fly over and find Bitcoin, and Bitcoin gave me the financial freedom that I desired. That I feel that now my job is to try and support wherever I can, so that others can build and govern the way that they want to govern. And these things are going less geographical now, and so ideas are government structures, and this is kind of where we end up where we are right now for technology. And so that's kind of like an ideological map of the world based upon my reticular activating system, where I see the things that I deleted and the things that I focused on. um, and I see central banking as critical to funding many of the wars that have led to one country being amazing, with amazing freedom, amazing growth, amazing capitalism, but completely destroying another nation in the process. So let's bring that to where we are today. When I saw October the 7th, I saw exactly what I see in the world right now, which is media controlling people based upon a government agenda to make people think that these were crazy terrorists that were committing evil acts for no other reason other than they hate the Jews. And from my perspective, I don't think that's true. I believe that there was, you know, the sins of my people, the British, promised the land to two different people, and Lord Rothschild was given land in order to create an expansive settler colonialism. And there was a people over years that fought many, many wars in order to expand that territory, because they were funded, or they were trained. The terrorist group that, from the Jewish side, that the British people classified terrorist at the time, and again, based upon a Zionist movement and a Zionism, I see as zero connection to the beautiful scriptures that I've read in the Torah and the Old Testament. And also the fact that the acts of our governments in the Europeans that led to the Holocaust and led to these acts that society has said are the worst types of genocides in all time, suddenly, through a Zionist mission that was not based upon religion, was simply based upon a capitalist idea from those that are not religious, to create a state so that certain laws could be used in order to steal land and expand. And that led to all sorts of problems. And then over time, we've had one of the government of that country in Israel whisper in the ear of America and lead them to believe that because they don't like the way Iran governs, and I definitely don't like the way Iran governs their people, but because they don't like that and they want military weapons and they don't want Iran to have military weapons, they persuaded America to come in and take out Saddam Hussein, which got replaced by ISIS, destabilized Iran and Saudi Arabia, and ended up with these different militia groups having to be created as a result of America implanting their foreign policies, which led to genocide after genocide, gross human rights violations that the American people get to benefit from, and they get fed a narrative to change their mind into thinking that actually we're fighting for our freedom, the Christians, we're fighting for our freedom from a nation that wants to kill us. And those nations that want to kill us, if we can connect them to this bogey monster called Islam, and we can make that connection, then we can justify the unjustifiable. And in fact, our actions are leading to the things, and we have end up with a superior mindset where we think we're the supremacists and these are the crazies, when really prior to all those actions, the Jewish people and the Muslim people were living in a state. Yes, there was Ottoman empires and various other things and bad things and colonialism that happens. But I see Israel as the government. And by the way, I don't say the people. I'm not talking about the people, and I'm not talking about the Jewish people. But Israel was created of Zionism, and Zionism, I think, is a very, very problematic thing. If you want to create Zionism, go create it where there's no people. But because they created it and the British people promised it to two different people, it created this thing that's never been solved and this massive struggle. And prior to October the 7th, there were 5 other October the 7th from the Israeli IDF government that used to be a terrorist organization called, when they were originally founded, that were trained by the Brits. There were 7 October the 7th that nobody knew about unless you sat in the extremes of the left side of the movement, because our government doesn't want to do that. And when I saw Biden come out and say 40 beheaded babies, I saw every single type of manipulation. And October the 8th, I wanted to speak out because I believed these acts were about to take us into World War III. And the scary thing is, we're going to enter into this massive bipolar world where so many people think that they're the good people in the West fighting the bad people that come from these terrorist regimes. And when they were painting, when Israel was very deliberately, the Israeli government, painting Hamas so deliberately as the same as ISIS, which is a truly evil terrorist regime, and comparing that to a resistance movement based upon the very same acts being inflicted upon them many times with disingenuous narratives that are complete fabrications of reality, that's when I started to say that my fundamental beliefs of what I need to do in the world is to try and help people have a bit more empathy for the fact that we are going to enter into World War III if you believe that to be true. And Iraq was a effing disaster, an absolute disaster. And we're trying to do it again because there's one government, Israel and Netanyahu. And again, I don't mean the Israeli people, I don't mean the Jews. I mean, there's one government that is willing to completely destabilize the Middle East in order to have nuclear supremacy and try and get America to kill their people and fight, because this is their way of expanding their goals and their supremacy and their belief that the way that they govern is superior and better.
Simon, I appreciate what you're saying, and I think what you were speaking about, this, um, impact that we have this emotional impact that locks us off from being able to see the world objectively is extremely problematic. So I completely agree with you there. Now, I'd like to go back to the introduction I gave. I've been on both sides of this conflict. I've been part of a refugee family. I've been part of the military. I've been a conscientious objector against the Israeli military. I've lived and volunteered in Arab neighborhoods. I've lived both sides of the conflict. And I think this gives me a very unique perspective. It allows me to do something which very few people do, which is to have a sense of empathy for both sides, to be able to see both sides of the argument. And I say this to you now because I was listening to you speak. And unfortunately, I have to tell you, the very thing that you were speaking against, this sort of one sided view of the world, is, I think, what you are unintentionally experiencing yourself. During what you were talking, during as you were speaking, you were jumping from one piece to another. Hong Kong and China, opium wars, the Gulf War, um, uh, um, ISIS and Hezbollah, the media. And I think the reason you were doing that is because as you observe the world, you do have a narrative inside of you that is trying to get out. It's not your narrative, it's a narrative that is there and that is blinding you to certain things. And so, like someone who is being blinded, your mind is glancing from one thing to another, seeing the superficial piece of it that you would like to see, and then immediately jumping to seek another confirmation, another example. Um, and I say this with empathy to you because I know that that's not the situation you want to be in. So, what I'm going to suggest is that we focus ourselves. Then, we've spoken enough about the broad things. I have presented where I'm coming from, and I've also presented this idea that there's something very precious in the values that liberal society creates. And I pointed that out because I wanted to avoid two things. I wanted to avoid creating a false equivalency, pretending as if societies that are not liberal hold the same values and are morally equivalent to, to societies that are liberal. I think that is a very, very dangerous mistake for us to make. They do not see the world in the way that we do. They do not share our values. And the second reason is because I believe the liberal world is under great attack right now. Russia and China and Iran and its proxies, and we see this happening at this very moment. Okay, so now let's take it to Israel and Palestine, which is a microcosm through which, a lens through which we can examine this without having to look at the full scope of history and all of the world in China and Russia in it. Okay, so you made a few claims, and I think they're very important claims um, because they're common and because they're mistaken. And I think it's very important to, if we want to be able to maintain objectivity, that we avoid using highly emotive words, which are not actually connected to reality or which means something else. And you used several of these. So some of the terms that you used was open air prison. You spoke about genocide. You spoke about Rothschild being given land. You spoke about a few other things, but I want to focus on those examples because those are the ones that are related to the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I would like to ask that we try to avoid those terms because they're both emotive and therefore subjective and inaccurate. And so I'll just very quickly go through each of those three and show that they're factually incorrect. With regards to the idea that Gaza was an open air prison, this is not true on many levels. First of all, for there to be a prison, somebody needs to control it. There needs to be a warden. Israel did not, before October 7th, control the borders of Gaza. It controlled the borders of Israel, but not of Gaza. Gaza was bordered with Egypt. people could come and go, and in fact they did. Your typical year would see anywhere between 1/4 to 1/3 of the population of Gaza come and go. They didn't just go to Egypt, they also went to Israel, both to work and to take advantage of Israel's hospitals, which they were provided free of charge. And to the extent that people were not allowed to leave Gaza, it was because in order to leave Gaza, you needed to get sign off from Hamas, and the Hamas government frequently did not provide certification or required bribes in order to receive it. In addition to this, Gaza had parks and universities and hospitals, very many wealthy people with penthouses and pools. It had amusement parks. It had all the trappings of modern society. In no way, not from a factual perspective, not from a freedom of movement perspective, not from a perspective of Israel control, and not from an economic perspective, was Gaza an open air prison. And yet we keep on hearing it. And you are very, very rightly, you're very concerned with propaganda. And that is a term of propaganda because it sounds like it means one thing, and the thing that it sounds like is untrue. Okay, let's talk about genocide. You have frequently repeated that Israel is engaged in a genocide, and this too is completely afactual. As of now, there have been between 20 and 25,000 dead in Gaza. We don't know exactly how many, but the estimates seem to indicate that that is the number, of which it is believed that between 9 and 10,000 were combatants. In other words, a ratio of 1.1 to 1 to 2.5. That is an extremely good ratio for urban warfare. In fact, it's almost unheard of. If you look at Mosul or Fallujah, which are not quite equivalent, they're much easier battles because the enemy wasn't embedded in the local population and dug underground. There you had casualty rates of civilians of 3 or 4 to 1. Second, we don't see any death camps. We don't see any shooting squads. We don't see any actual attempt at eliminating the population. In fact, quite the opposite. Israel has gone to great lengths to inform the population as to where it's going to be attacking. Israel is, to this day, the primary supplier of water, electricity, and medical supplies to Gaza. And Israeli soldiers have frequently placed themselves in danger in order to provide corridors of safe passage to Gazans who were fleeing areas of active combat. And there are indications that not only were Hamas militants firing at Israeli soldiers during these moments, but also at the fleeing Gazans themselves. So, unquestionably, there has been great suffering. Far too many people have died, and far too many of them are civilians or innocents. But nowhere are we anywhere near the criteria that we should associate with the word, the extremely emotionally charged and therefore propagandist word of genocide. And then finally, you claim that Rothschild was given land. And this is entirely untrue. One of the fascinating things about the creation of Israel.
So just to be clear, he wasn't given land; he was the broker of the deal. But carry on. Just want to make sure you understand my.
So just to be clear, Jews were not given land at all. Jews purchased land from their rightful owners, and the first
Yago, I
time.
believe he's discussing the accords for them to come on over is the deal he's discussing, not any land deal. Correct, Simon?
Well, you carry on.
Sure. So I would just say that the first time that land was taken forcibly by Jews was during the War of Independence, which was effectively a civil war, and where Israel and the Jewish population were not the aggressors; they had been attacked. And in the course of the war, which was a war of defense, although of course they were, there were many terrible things that happened during that war, which were done by Jews and which are inexcusable. And one of those things is that they did capture territory, and in some instances even forced the civilian population to flee. But that was the first instance of Jews forcefully taking land, and it's actually very easy to see that this would be the case, because until that point, the Jewish population or the Zionist population were in no position physically. They had no power with which to take land. And so in what you were saying, there were three very important factual errors. And the reason that's important is because that's going to color your perception. And actually, I think that's an inaccurate description. I think the reason you have those inaccuracies is because your perception is coloring your understanding of the facts. And so what I hope that we can try and do here, and I know this is, it's a difficult and emotive subject, but I'm trying to express to you that we do share a lot of values. We, as you stated at the beginning, share the ultimate goal. And I'm imploring you to try and recognize that unfortunately your thinking right now is extremely biased.
Okay, awesome. So here's what I suggest. I suggest I respond to just some of those things, and then I think we should. I think we've got a really good understanding of our positionings and the different narratives, and then I think we should just pivot to what do you think we should do now, and then maybe we just do two of those, and then I think we should focus on the things that we do align on, which is the Bitcoin side as a mechanism for freeing us from some of the oppressions that are inflicted. How does that sound, Yogo? I'm
Sounds
sure there's going to be
excellent.
more.
I think that's a great decision. It would be very surprising to me if we managed to resolve the Israel-Palestinian conflict on this spaces. I think it requires at least two spaces.
Absolutely. Okay.
At
So,
least
so here's what I see. Again, I talked about the reticular activating system because all humans are subject to it. It's actually it's something that we have to actually have in our brain to stop us going, actually crazy. And so everything that stated that I'm doing, in my mind, as you said those things, I was thinking the exact same thing of you. And so I think that's the
Well,
thing.
I would like to understand where you think I was being inaccurate.
Okay. So all of these things, you can find a complete alternative reality of truth, and a lot of evidence.
But Simon, I'm not interested in alternative realities and truth. I'm interested only in the facts and the actual truth.
Okay. So you talked about the open air prison. This was a term that was used by the most reputable humanitarian aid organizations in the world that did those assessments, independent of the Israeli government or the Palestinian government. So independent, reputable. Now we could say they're corrupt, and
but Simon, I don't care what we say about them, and I don't care what they say. I'm not interested in gossip, and I'm not interested in propaganda from
that's
either
not
side.
gossip. That's academic research
No.
from humanitarian groups.
That's their claim. What I'm asking you for is what are the facts? What is the
Okay.
evidence that supports the claim?
So let me go through each one. And I'm not saying these are true because I don't think we're going to get to that debate because I've sat through 1,000 of them, and you probably know as well as I know that each side has a completely different alternative reality of what happened for the exact same events, and they both believe them to be 100% the facts. And the reason we believe they're the facts is because that's what the government wanted us to believe in order to justify their actions. So when you talk about not having, I guess you'll probably say there was an occupation and then there was a negotiation, and then repeatedly the Palestinian people didn't take, and the Israeli people were constantly trying to negotiate, and um, those types of narratives. Everything you're seeing from the Israeli government is showing the exact opposite right now. There was a conference 3 days ago where many members of the Israeli government were combined with thousands of Israeli people that were dancing at a conference where they were all discussing the sheer joy and delight that they have around the concept of building their new settlements in Gaza. And I'm not talking about the West Bank.
Sure.
The occupation.
So, Simon, hold on.
Yeah.
Which of my points are you rebutting now? You made three
Okay,
claims:
so
open air prison, genocide, and Rothschild given land. could you let's focus.
Okay,
Let's
so
either do one
let's
or
do
one at a
let's do
time.
the open air prison, right? Okay, so the open air prison is where you say you retreat in 2006 based upon a ceasefire, and then Hamas broke that ceasefire. But there was a massive blockade. There was all sorts of evidence that back up, that this was completely, this wasn't independence. This was, the walls that were built and everything that you can hear about what led to those facts that actually exist. If you think that this was just, a complete withdrawal, and not an open air prison, then you have a very different view to the historical independent documents. And I don't want to go through them all because it would end up in a massively debate around each one. But they're currently blockaded, and that blockade means that the only way that they can get out if they want to enjoy the Israeli way of life is that they have to sign up to an apartheid regime, and they have to sign up to 65 different laws for them, as opposed around property rights and the very things that you think are most important. And if they don't agree to those, then they're gradually expelling millions of people into Gaza, with the situation where they've implemented some of the most aggressive technology in order to survey a population that the Israeli military industrial complex is actually exporting and selling for $12.5 billion of revenue a year to other oppressive regimes that want to implement open air prison technology on those
Simon, may
populations.
I interject just a moment? Sorry to interrupt you, but I think this is a perfect example, right? I'm trying to narrow the scope because there's a million different facts, a million different points, a million different arguments, right?
Okay, well,
I'm
let's just
using,
get it to.
hold on. Let me just finish this thought and I'll hand it back to you, right? So I took uh, umbrage with your use of the term, of the specific term, open air prison. And now you've come and said there was a blockade and a whole bunch of other stuff. And I agree with you. Everything you're saying about that is true. But none of those things equate to an open air prison. And the reason I point this out is because by using words that are inaccurate in one instance and doing it repeatedly in multiple incidences, you lose the ability to see the truth.
Okay, got you. So, there's a bunch of stuff around that, but then we talk about the genocide stuff. So, genocide was a perception that I saw building up where how would I want to expel or ethnically cleanse a population? Um, and if I could get away with, what would I do in order to get away with that in the model era? Well, what I would do is I would lock them in a region. I would make sure that humanitarian aid doesn't get in. I'd make sure that I disable all of their hospitals and commit war crimes, that targets. And I'd say the justification for that is because we're blowing up people, simply because they're using human shields. And we've got a tunnel underneath that doesn't really get affected. And so we're willing to break all of the conventions and international laws that the South African government is presenting the case for in the ICJ, that the ICJ doesn't say is meritless right now. And I'd starve them, and I'd make sure that they can't get water, and I'd make sure that there's a famine, because then you don't actually need to blow them up. But you can blow up all the infrastructure so it's completely unlivable. You can make sure that they all live in tents in unbearable types of conditions, that any other government in the world, if Putin and Russia were doing the same thing, they would be calling for their arrest, calling for them to be defunded, and calling for them to never allow this to ever happen again, especially if it was happening in Israel from Muslim and brown people. And so the types of things that are happening in Gaza right now, nobody can accept it. I will never, ever forgive what I have seen since October the 7th being inflicted upon civilians. I have never experienced anything like it in my life. Watching it, not from the perspective of what the Israeli media want you to see, but from the perspective of what you probably say is Qatar manipulated Al Jazeera that has an ulterior agenda. The war crimes will be convicted. They are horrific. And if you speak to the people that are experiencing right now, I can only imagine what they are experiencing relative. And the only thing that allows them to put up with it is the fact that they have a belief in God that is unparalleled, where they believe if they continue to stay on their lands that people are trying to steal, then they are literally, going to have a good relationship with their creator. And that's the only thing that can get them through the horrific crimes that are being committed upon the people in Gaza right now. And we can see the whole thing. The whole thing has been documented on Twitter Spaces. The whole thing has been documented on videos. And these are horrific war crimes that I believe we will talk about in the future. And America needs to figure out how the hell did we end up in a position where we were paying for this. And so the ICJ will get the result of that. We will find out whether the powers that be are able to get that in the direction that they want. We can see in clear eyes that the horrific acts that Putin and Russia are inflicting are the very same acts, are a lot worse, that are being inflicted by the Israeli government, but they're being backed by the side that we're meant to believe are the good people. You talk about that, if you don't think that those that have been taken out of Gaza, that have been arrested, beaten up, and yes, you can say you call them terrorists because they're, putting up some kind of resistance, but they're taken into a prison with no due process that we have in the rest. They're locked up for 6 months, and every 6 months they can be retrialed again without any kind of due process. And that is the reason why October the 7th happened. Because if you look at Hamas's previous actions, they did acts in order to do hostage swaps because they believe what you call a prisoner is a hostage to them. And so while we get to reframe it and say these people are taking hostages and those people are taking terrorist prisoners, when you look at what happened when actually Israeli hostages did come out, they said the IDF was shooting at us and all these different things that we've seen. And these investigations will come. There is a complete narrative war in order to perceive that there is just reason for why this is being done. Um, what else did you talk about?
May I?
Yeah.
So let me point out once again, all right? You've pointed out many things which are true, all right? There is a large number of Palestinians who are taken prisoner, are arrested in Israel. There is many horrific casualties. There are people suffering, and there has been massive destruction and damage to the civilian infrastructure. So those are all facts. Where I again am objecting is when is you were pointing to all of these things, right? But none of them amount to what you're claiming, which is genocide. Genocide is a very, very specific thing. Genocide is the deliberate attempt in action, not in, rhetoric, to eliminate a people. And that
I noticed you said not rhetoric because they said that they're doing it.
yeah, because if I say I'm going to kill you, it's not the same as
And
me
if,
actually
if
killing you.
Biden and Putin said that, you would certainly take that as genocidal intent if
Well,
they
I
said
take I
everything
no
that the
no
Israeli
no
government has been
I
saying.
certainly wouldn't. I certainly wouldn't. Just because somebody says something stupid doesn't mean that they or certainly the institution that they are part of are going to take action. And we can look at the actions and we see that it's that there's nothing like that happening. Now, neither of these points matter in and of themselves. The reason they matter is because there are 1,000 points of fact. There are 1,000 arguments and claims. And when one starts mixing truth with falsehood, one loses the ability to correctly assess the situation. So, yes, there are many Palestinians, 10,000 more or less, who are in Israeli prisons. All right? That is a fact. But
And are they inflicted to the same types of? Do you believe people when they say they were raped and they were committed as torture? Do you just think they're lying, or the
Well,
people that have come out
certainly,
they've managed to
certainly,
free?
certainly, torture does occur, 100%. Israel, specifically the Shabak, which is the Internal Security Service, does engage in torture. And rape almost certainly doesn't happen. And I say this on the basis of multiple different studies that have actually from the extremely left-wing liberal studies, which examined the subject of why there are no rapes. Why do Israelis not rape Palestinians? Everyone else rapes their enemies. Why is it that Israelis don't? And the argument made was that Israelis don't engage in rape because they're so racist. They're so racist that they've turned Palestinians into such subhuman creatures that they don't
Yago, if I could
engage.
jump in real quick, there are reports of rape within the prison systems within Israel of
Yes,
Palestinian
yes,
prisoners.
yes, yes. There are reports. There also are reports of Palestinian prisoners raping Israeli wardens, right?
I don't
What
think that, I think what you're referring to is the warden that had a relationship with several Palestinians. I don't believe it was rape.
uh, there's more than one instance of this occurring.
If you could
Um,
share with us, I'd appreciate that.
I would need to do a Google search right now and to share. But um, there are claims. There are always claims, right? But certainly there is zero evidence of anything systemic. And if, in fact, it's exactly the opposite. Now, be that as it may, again, here we have another claim, right? Um, but it doesn't equate to genocide. And the reason this is important is because you're looking at the tragedy. You are extremely, your heart is, and this is exactly the right reaction. Your heart is rendered by the tragedy that you see occurring in front of you, and you want it to stop, but you cannot equate it to, for example, as you did, Russia and Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine. Israel didn't invade Gaza. In fact, it was invaded by Gaza. And that makes a very big difference. There's a huge difference between a murderer and someone who kills in
But you,
self-defense.
you agree that this is a nuance in terms of occupied territory versus two different
No,
countries,
I
and that
absolutely don't agree that it's a nuance. I think
Israel
it's fundamental.
continually breaches the ceasefire and kills people and takes over their land, continually commits acts as equal as October the 7th by international humanitarian standards that looks exactly like October the 7th, and more Gazans were killed before, and more West Bank were killed before, and more ceasefires was inflicted upon the Israeli side than the rest. And this is where, it's not as straightforward, because you believe that not to be true, the other side believe that to be true.
No, I'm not arguing it straightforward. I think this is an extremely complicated and messy situation with evil, great evil on both
Sorry, one
sides.
question: do you believe Israel has ever inflicted an event similar to October the 7th upon the people of Gaza?
No, of course not.
You really don't think so?
No.
None of the previous documented crises, you believe that none of those were similar to October the 7th, but inflicted the other way around?
Yes, and
And
there's a
is
very
that
big
because
difference.
what do you believe happened on October the 7th?
So the difference is that on October the 7th, there was an invasion in which people, uh, the, the reason we call them terrorists is because what they were engaged in is the act of terrorism. And the reason it's called the act of
As settlers
terrorism,
terrorists, if they kill people and take over people's lands, they have no right
yes,
to be.
settlers who kill Palestinians are terrorists. And there are multiple cases of settlers engaging in terrorism. And what happens when they do is they are arrested and they go to trial. And there are many,
So
not many,
they're
but
not weaponized by the Israeli government. They're not escorted into those homes. That's never caught on video.
sorry, they're not escorted. No, what? So
Don't have like the Israeli police there
I've
at the
been in the
same
West
time as
Bank.
they're doing it and
I,
giving
I
them the guns and
so
allowing them to have
I've
guns
been a
when the
soldier in the West
Palestinians
Bank.
can't have it.
I've been a soldier in the West Bank. I'll tell you a little bit about it in a moment. But you asked me a question, I'd like to respond. No, Israel has never engaged um, during the period of its statehood, with possibly two exceptions that occurred in 1948, which are debatable, but that was a long time ago, and it was during a very different situation. But certainly, since 1948, Israel has never engaged in the targeted and intentional killing of the civilian population. There have been many Palestinian civilians who have been killed um, in the conflict. Conflict is a atrocious thing. It is a monster that we must do everything to snuff out. But there is a huge difference, and so no, there is no equivalence. Now, with regards to the soldiers operating in the West Bank, I've been there, and it is one of the most terrible things to ask a person to do, because as a soldier, you are sent to guard people who hate you. The settlers of the West Bank hate the Israeli soldiers. They consider them an impotent. They
Why?
spit on them. Why?
Why?
Because
It's
the
not because
Israel
they're Jewish. It's because they're occupying. It's because they're keep the. Why do you think? Why do you think a resistance movement needs to pick up arms? Do they do that because there's nothing to defend against? Do they do that because they've got a perfectly good system working and the people feel like they need to create resistance and pick up arms? Like, is that just literally? Do you believe that's the genocide of the Jews from Muslim people that hate Jews?
No, I don't think that there is a genocide occurring of Jews either. I don't think there's any genocide occurring. I think there was terrorism. There's no genocide. Um,
Two-way terrorism or one-way?
Certainly, as I have said, there have been Jewish terrorists. There have been Jewish terrorists who targeted British
And why
people
why are
as
they
well,
never called? Why are they never called terrorists? But if you're Muslim, you are called a terrorist.
because propagandists don't want to use the word terrorist, but certainly they are in Israel called terrorists, and they go to jail for engaging in the act of terrorism. The Israeli right doesn't like to call them terrorists, and in fact, Rabin, the Prime Minister of Israel, who guided Israel and Palestine effectively through the Oslo process, or at least its early stages, was assassinated. He was assassinated by a Jew. This Jew, in certain circles of the far right in Israel, is celebrated. He's currently sitting in prison um, on a life sentence, as are uh, multiple others who have attacked and killed. Um, they've set fire to, engaged in arson, or shot Palestinians, are also sitting in prison, and they are treated by parts of the Israeli right wing as heroes. This is disgusting, it's despicable, and those members of Israeli society are not part of liberal society. Um, so I'm not trying to defend things which I find despicable myself. What I'm trying to do here is find objectivity and truth, and to point out that the reason, let me actually take a step back. Why is this whole situation so intractable? The reason the situation is intractable is because you have a liberal society. It's the only place in the world where you have a liberal society living hand in hand with an illiberal society. And that conflict, we still haven't, we're figuring out now whether or not it can be resolved, because it's never happened before. So to explain to you the difference in mindset, I'll give you um, two examples. When I moved into my house in Jaffa, which is in an Arab neighborhood, I was renting from an Arab landlord. The first day that I was there, the um, head of the Hamula, which is a family or a clan, uh, caught me on the street and threatened to kill me if I ever caused trouble. That was the way he welcomed me into the neighborhood. It wasn't because I was Jewish. It was because I wasn't part of his clan. and he was engaged in active warfare with other clans in parts of the neighborhood. This is, what we would maybe call gang warfare, but it is on the basis of hereditary genetic lines, families, and it has been going on for centuries. The um, the Bedouins have a saying. They say, "Me against my brother, me and my brother against my cousin, me, my brother, and my cousin against the clan, and me, my brother, my cousin, and the clan against the other clan." That's sort of a well-known saying. It's a very tribalistic society, very dissimilar to what we're familiar with. A different example I'll give you is I went to teach in an Arab school, and I wanted to find a topic that we could discuss where we could discuss morality and ethics, and it could be topical and interesting to them. And in the newspaper that day was an article about an honor killing. An honor killing is when um, a family perceives that the daughter or the sister has engaged in something that dishonors the family. Typically, it would be flirting or maybe even sex with someone out of wedlock. And then they kill her. That's an honor killing. And I was teaching at the time in a school just outside of Tel Aviv. This was a very wealthy Arab neighborhood. And these are people who are exposed to Israeli education, although a parallel sort of Arab education, but also Israeli newspapers, Israeli culture. And I walked into his classroom of 40 kids, and I said, today we'll talk about this. And just to try and get the conversation going, I asked who was in favor of honor killings. And my jaw dropped the ground because 38 of 40 hands went up. 16-year-olds. And then I asked the boys, wait, you think that if your sister does this, you should kill her? He says, it is my obligation to kill her. And I asked the girls, you think that if you do this, you should be killed? And she said, of course, dishonoring the family, I should be killed. Now, this is not a theoretical construct for them. This is something which happens, and that Israeli law has been fighting against. This, again, a very different set of values. So now we have two peoples who effectively can't live together as one society uh, because the gulf of values is so wide. And then the
Right.
question becomes how can they possibly resolve the situation given that they are on the same piece of
Yeah,
land? And
let's
that's
go
what
there.
makes it so
Let's go there.
complicated.
Let's go there, Yago. I tell you what, because I've got. Let's do. I really appreciate everything you just shared there. I found it very interesting. I do want to say there is a bit of a connotation that these are the types of things that Muslims might think are acceptable, and that's just simply not the case. There's nothing in the Quran that says that that's an act, and I just want to make sure that people understand that.
100%. No, this is
Yeah.
not about Muslims. It's specifically about the Palestinian culture. Not even all Palestinian cultures, but a
Gentlemen,
large majority of it.
gentlemen, if I could just come in here 1 second, I would be doing my job here as a mediator. We have veered off severely from the debate being about Bitcoin and the war. So I just wanted to remind you guys, if you want to veer off from the topic, that's completely fine. But let's just remember, it was a Bitcoin debate.
Thanks, Ryan. Let's do two questions, and I think 5 minutes each, and then we'll wrap it up because we ain't going to get done on this one. And I just want to really appreciate. I think this has been, a really two-sided things, and the audience get to decide where they want to research further. I think we've given a lot of things for people to research and come to their own perspectives. So I reckon let's do the question of how do we avoid World War III? 5 minutes each, and then where does Bitcoin fit into the equation? 5 minutes each, and then let's wrap up. How does that sound?
Sounds great. You want to go first or second?
Okay, all right. Well, I'll go. How do we avoid World War III? So, from my map of the world, that Yago thinks I see from a perspective that's based upon everything I want to see. And if you go back to the beginning of this conversation, our core values that drive how we see things, um, I believe that there are two very important oil producing, powerful nations within the Middle East. One of them is Iran, and one of them is Saudi Arabia. And there is a bunch of proxy wars that are occurring throughout the Middle East with US interference because there are certain allies being formed that I think could lead us to World War III. And so I see three different things that would need to happen in order to avoid World War III. I think we need to normalize the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and not sidestep Iran, which Israel would like to do. They would love for Iran for Iran to be sidestepped and use American people to wage a war in order to make sure that Saudi Arabia takes their side and UAE takes their side, and the good people that are the superiors are the ones that get their way, and they get to build a corridor, which is all about money at the end of the day. It's all about oil routes. It's all about military industrial complex, and it's all about expanding certain areas of capitalism that lead to very bad outcomes for society. And so Iran and I said it like an American, um, Iran and Saudi Arabia need to be normalized. I think there's only one country that can do that, and that's the one that doesn't take sides, and that's China. And I think that's a real problem for America, because America is used to being the one that can create peace agreements, and China's the only one that can do that. And that's because of the BRICS alliance. And the BRICS alliance consists now of Saudi Arabia and Iran, and Israel 100% doesn't want that to happen. So normalization needs to happen, and America needs to accept that we live in a bipolar world where there's actually going to be multiple empires that need to figure out how to get on, because if we don't figure out how to get on, then we're all going to destroy the system and the fabric of society that we've worked so hard to get to right now. The second thing is that every single country in the Middle East, with the exception of a few that rely upon Israeli military industrial complex, agree that there has to be a Palestinian state. And Saudi Arabia agrees with that. Iran agrees with that, and the whole of the Middle East needs to there does need to be a Palestinian state, and Palestine and Israel need to figure out what that looks like with the United Nations and whoever to go back at that with the whole world watching. And they can't be ethnically cleansed. They can't be expelled. They can't become refugees. They can't be forced to live in Jordan. They can't be forced to live in Egypt. There has to be a recognition that there are that needs to happen, and America want that. And if they don't get that, then America should defund Israel, and allow them to figure out what would happen when they defund them and stop providing weapons. And UK should do the same, and Germany should do the same. Um, that's the second thing I think needs to happen. And the third thing that needs to happen is America needs to start looking after its own people and protecting the issues it has in its own borders. And they all need to retreat, and all those foreign things that are about to lead to the death of a lot of Americans and an escalation into World War III, because we've already seen three of them, and this is going to be a tick for tack, and it's going to get worse and worse and worse. Just listen to what the people in their country want, not the disparers that are saying, we want you to topple the Iranian regime for us when I live in the comfort of my home in America. I'm talking about people that want America to pack up their military bases, leave, and just focus on using US taxpayer money to look after America, protect their borders, and make sure that America is getting what American people actually want, rather than standing by Israel. And if you have those three things, and we accept that there is a multipolar world where there's going to be these factions and alliances that have to figure out how to get on with each other, because everybody does have a nuke and no one wants to fire those nukes, and there is no fake threat that Iran's going to suddenly come up and blow a nuke up in America if we don't have these bases. Then until then, I think we escalate to World War III. If the world can accept that that's where we get to through diplomacy, then I think we avoid World War III and we go to a better place. And anyone that doesn't like to live there, they can live in the world of Bitcoin. It's the best government in the world.
Thank you, Simon. I think we're at a very important juncture, a very dangerous time, but also a very promising time. You made a distinction between two possible worlds, a unipolar world under America, or a multipolar world under America and Russia and China and who knows who else. I would like to see neither of those outcomes. I think that we have the opportunity, maybe for the first time, to live in a non-polar world, to live in a world where there are no great empires. And I think that Bitcoin is the primary driver that allows us to get there. My view and the reason everything I'm working on, I work on a project called Sovereign, and it's called that for a reason. It, it, what we're trying to do is we're trying to build the infrastructure, the institutional infrastructure to create, built on Bitcoin, actual alternatives to national governments. Not just for money, but for all the other important institutions of society. Now, um, I think it's beyond the scope of this conversation to describe exactly what that would look like, but I've described it elsewhere. And I think everyone can see a hint of it in Bitcoin, in DAOs, in the global, borderless, and open to everyone economy that we've created in the world of crypto. But we are also at a moment of danger. And the reason we're at a moment of danger is because the US, and certainly not Russia and China, do not want to see this non-polar world come into existence. And we see right now that it is not just Israel that is under threat, it is the whole world. Right? What the Houthi are doing is they're endangering the entire world's commerce. What Russia is doing in the Black Sea is endangering the entire world's commerce. What China is doing in the South China Sea is endangering the very fabric of free trade and global commerce. And they're doing this as the first step in their attempt to unwind liberal society. Now, we've been here before. In the early part of the 20th century, fascism rose in Spain and was supported in a proxy war by Nazi Germany, and the West did not get involved. And then fascism rose in Italy, and the West did not get involved. And then Germany invaded Austria, and an armistice was signed by Chamberlain. There was every attempt by liberal society to try and avoid war. And with each finger they gave, they just increased the appetite of the autocratic fascist regimes that were seeking domination.
Yago, I'm sorry to interrupt you, gentlemen. I apologize. Something has come up. I have to step out. There's something going on in the background. I have to step out for
All right, Brian,
professional
you go.
stuff.
We're gonna wrap up after
All right.
Yago's.
I
Thank you
appreciate
very
both of
much.
you. Thank you for having me, and a good debate. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. So, as much as I hate national governments, we do live still in a world of national governments. And if the governments of liberal societies show weakness in this moment, they only whet the appetite for increased escalation. It is from the Bible, right? It is an old piece of wisdom that he who wishes peace must prepare for war. It is only through strength, only through credible deterrence, that we can even have the opportunity for negotiation. The diplomacy that you seek is possible only when it is clear to our adversaries that it is the most likely path for them to achieve what they desire, because the path of violence will end poorly. And that level of deterrence is very, very important. So uh, when we see what's happening in Gaza, and when we see what's happening in Ukraine, and when we see what's happening in the South China Sea, and when we see what's happening in Yemen, these are all parts of the same piece. They're the proxy first feints of a disliberal order probing at the liberal order to see whether or not it will show backbone. And we have to show backbone. And that unfortunately does still require the power of great nations. And so, as much as I would like to see us be able to get rid of great nations, unfortunately, I think the reality is that we're not there yet. Now, with regards to the question of of solving the Israel-Palestine conflict. Um, Unfortunately, I don't see a resolution here, not in the near term. And the reason is the fact that the Palestinian people, as a people, do not have any institutional infrastructure with which to form a nation or make peace. They are riven amongst themselves, and they are dominated by much larger powers who have developed the institutional power, right? Have developed the institutions and the functions and the relationships to use the divisions within Palestinian society itself as a proxy for them to gain their own benefit. Unfortunately, the Palestinians are amongst the most long suffering people precisely because they've been turned into a piece on the chessboard. And so, for us to achieve um, a resolution and peace, what we need to do is we need to start by building up the independence and particularly the institutions um, within the Palestinian population. What I'm going to say now is going to sound uh, um, extremely chauvinistic, but I think it is an objective reality, unfortunately. I do not believe that in the current situation, the Palestinian people are capable of forming a country which can live in peace with Israel because there's far too much of their society which is funded by Iran and others, which will derail any path towards peace. Um, and so, what I would like to see Israel do, in collaboration with other powers like Saudi Arabia and Jordan, like the United States and Europe, is to recognize this fact, because so long as we're unable to recognize reality, we will continue to make the same mistakes, and start working to build up Palestinian society from an economic perspective, from an educational perspective, and most importantly, from the perspective of creating autonomous, unaligned, strong governance institutions. And I think the path towards that is autonomy, not full statehood, with the ultimate goal of achieving statehood once the Palestinians are able to provide security to their own people and, by extension, provide security to Israel from their people.
All right, thank you very much for that perspective. So I think the audience got as polar opposite perspectives as possible. Um, and I don't know who's going to be wrong or who's going to be right. In fact, what I'm talking about is what I'd like to see happen, but the world doesn't often go the way that you like. And so, what I would love to see is that the brothers and sisters in Palestine get to rebuild their economy. There's an amazing concept which is Bitcoin, and Bitcoin and the tools that Yago and everyone else in our community are building, we believe, are going to be able to make a significant difference in the way that the world works and governance works. And hey, us humans are so absolutely freaking crazy, and see and live in these alternative realities that I'm sure artificial intelligence is going to come along and say, you humans are absolutely crazy. I know the truth, and we'll show you how to do it, and we'll all be governed by bots and artificial intelligence in the future. And the only thing that's going to protect humanity at that stage, I think, is a force that AI can't combat, and that is proof of work, and that is Bitcoin. And I think that I think countries that are in a position to rebuild, they should rebuild with some of these tools. Look at what El Salvador's doing when it freed itself from some of the civil wars and mafia oppression that was facing them in their country. And Bitcoin's an incredible tool for sovereign nations to figure out how to do things. And the beauty of it is, if you are a Christian, a Muslim, or a Jew, you know that all of those religious scriptures teach the problems with riba, with interest, and fiat currency and proof of weapons. is built upon interest, and that creates society that ends up in these conflicts as a result of the nature of that. And Bitcoin, I believe, to be one of the most halal forms of money that the world has ever seen. And it meets all the criteria of all the religious scriptures of how to actually have sustainable society and wealth creation with unique cultures that see things in different ways, live by different scriptures. And I hope we get there. And I think that Bitcoin is a force that helps us get there. And I will always respect Yago's experiences, what Yago's doing, Yago's intentions. And I think as long as we can respect each other's, not question each other's intentions, but understand that actually the way we get to a better world is in this polarity and this friction of ideas and technology. So grateful that we live in a world today where I'm fortunate enough, because for whatever reason it may be, and we believe those are for different reasons, that I get to communicate with people that have experienced so many different things and are able to share with them different ideas, and that's a blessing. And I hope the whole world gets to experience that at some stage. And I think it's friction that gets us there. And everyone needs to protect themselves, because I do believe that the best government and form of money in the world is Bitcoin. And it's the only reason that I'm able, even speaking with Yago and understanding all his different experiences and backgrounds, and able to debate about these things. So I'll leave you to do your final words, and then I think we'll wrap it up. I really enjoyed it, Yago.
Thank you very much, Simon. I think we have yet to see the full promise of liberal society and what it can bring. And I think Bitcoin is the key. I don't think Bitcoin fixes the situation in any near-term sense. But ultimately, these great tragedies, the fact that they're all caused by nations going to war, countries going to war, they're all caused by the mechanism of state, which turns individuals into cogs in the machine of state. And what Bitcoin promises is, over time, perhaps even more quickly than we realize, to remove from the state its ability to control individuals' property, to control individuals' commerce, and to tax or inflate away people's savings in order to fund their wars. And so while I don't think that Bitcoin fixes this immediately, I do think that Bitcoin is the only path towards fixing this ultimately. And and I think that peace is possible once we defang the machinery of state, and once we take individuals and remove them from the state of being cogs in that machine. And so I think that's why Simon and I both see the end result being the same, and we hope that it comes sooner rather than later. And I think it's really important that we each do what we can to secure our own personal liberties through Bitcoin and through the wider crypto ecosystem. I started this space by saying that my belief is, and everything that I've learned, is that all personal freedoms, all personal rights ultimately rest on the right of personal property and the right to free commerce. And that is what makes Bitcoin such a powerful tool. Simon, thank you very much for helping to organize this space. I hope this has been illuminating and interesting to people, and I hope we all achieve the highest level of individual sovereignty and stay sovereign.
Awesome. Okay, put your comments in the comments underneath this. There's a little pill in the bottom right corner. Put your comments underneath them. Yago and I will read them all, and we'll endeavor to share things that we think are interesting if you ask questions and share your opinion. Yeah, we would bring people up, but I've got to end the debate now, and I'm happy with the time that we took and the different points, and I'm sure there's going to be many more. So thank you, everybody.